You are listening to Down Home. Author E.J. Patton once wrote, "Power without compassion is the worst kind of evil there is." This quote embodies the actions of enslavers during the Atlantic slave trade. Their pursuit of profit and dominance was marked by a complete disregard for human dignity and suffering. Enslavers exercised their power with ruthless efficiency, tearing individuals from their families, subjecting them to brutal conditions, and stripping them of their basic humanity. The enslavers' actions were driven by a cold calculus of economic gain, where the lives of millions of Africans were reduced to mere commodities. This absence of compassion allowed them to rationalize the inhumanity of their deeds, justifying the exploitation and dehumanization of others as a necessary means to an end. The systemic cruelty of the Atlantic slave trade is a stark example of how power, when wielded without empathy or ethical consideration, can lead to profound and widespread evil. Patton's quote serves as a poignant reminder of the moral failures that underpin such historical atrocities. It challenges us to reflect on the importance of compassion in the exercise of power and to recognize the devastating consequences when it is absent. In our first episode of the series, we explored the immense profits generated by the transatlantic slave trade. Today, in part 2, we focus on how European powers wielded their influence to enslave Africans. If you haven't listened to the first part of the business of slavery, the episode can be found in the episode list. I'm Derek Wise, and on behalf of Jay Jones, welcome to Down Home, the Canadian experience from two black men.
Breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground, simple breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground, simple breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground, simple breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground, yeah. On a high plateau, from the one down below to the future of the funk, getting lost in the flow, contact with.
All right, so this is part 2 of our series regarding the business of slavery.
Yes.
So yeah, this one we kind of took. We went off and did our own research and about the major African nations or peoples that were involved in the transatlantic slave trade. Before we get into it, though, I do want to acknowledge, yes, there was slavery before the transatlantic slave trade.
Yes.
There was, and we know that. I don't know. We don't get a lot of comments, but I'm sure there will be someone that makes the comment that, there was hundreds of years of history of slave trade in Africa beforehand. Yes, there was. There was the trans-Sahara slave trade. But just to give you an idea of why we're focusing on the transatlantic slave trade, the trans-Sahara slave trade, there's evidence that it started around 300 BC, right?
Yeah.
And it lasted right up until the British colonies abolished slavery, which is the early 1800s. We're talking about 2,000 years.
Yep.
Right. And there's an estimate. I saw one estimate on a historic website that between 6 to 10 million African slaves were transported during that time period, during over 2,000 years. And as we spoke about in the last episode, over the period between 1500 to the middle of 1800, which is, about 350 years, there was estimated between 12 to 16 million Africans that were transported over the transatlantic slave trade, just to give you the scope of why we are focusing on the transatlantic slave trade. Almost, on the lower ends of the estimate, almost double the amount of individuals captured into slavery over a fraction of that time period.
Yeah.
So, the Europeans did it, and they did it on steroids.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a very good jump off point, because
how slavery sort of came to be. Yes, I'm going to talk about the before the Atlantic slave trade, but there are tons of kingdoms, right? So, and they had different levels of slavery, not always just labor slavery, but servitude, like companionship, all different kinds. And then and like Derek said, this was BC, and it continued after the fall of the Roman Empire. But then when it came to the African sort of African part of slavery, a lot of the kingdoms used these people as they had as slaves, sometimes to trade for goods, to barter or repay debts or whatever. And then, like Derek said, the Europeans came over, and then it's switched. But one of the biggest sort of supporters of the slave trade was a Queen Nzinga, I believe.
Queen Nzinga, also known as Nzinga Mbade, was a formidable 17th century ruler of Ndongo and Matamba kingdoms in what is now Angola. Born in 1583, she ascended to the throne in 1624 after the death of her brother. Nzinga is renowned for exceptional diplomatic and military skills. As with any historical figure, Queen Nzinga's legacy is complex. While she is documented as a participant in the Atlantic slave trade, she later became a key figure in resisting Portuguese colonial efforts. This duality highlights the complexity of the African historical narrative when it comes to slavery. Despite her involvement in the slave trade, Nzinga's enduring legacy is that of a warrior queen who fiercely defended her people against colonization.
She was born into a royal family, and her father actually favored her a lot. So at a young age, she got trained to be a warrior. She got trained to fight alongside of her father, and got well versed in the sort of political dealings of what they were doing and what her father was doing. So there came a time when she took over the reins and was the queen, and she sold over 200,000 slaves to the Portuguese, and and that was a big role into how it sort of started from there. And the Portuguese, that was the start of their sort of big role, probably the biggest role, even more so than the British and the Americans and the Europeans, was the Portuguese. So Queen Nzinga, she was very powerful, and even when she struck up a good deal with the Dutch, and just became a big part of the Atlantic slave trade, and you had different tribes, and this is just to move on, they had different tribes from different areas would go to different villages and try to catch people off guard and either kidnap people or pillage the villages or whatever the case may be, and then they became the middlemen to deal with the Europeans. So it was just big business,
The Atlantic slave trade was not only a brutal system, but also a highly strategic one. European enslavers quickly realized that their success depended on the cooperation of local African leaders. They lacked the manpower and knowledge to capture a large number of Africans on their own, so they turned to manipulation and coercion to achieve their aims. One of the primary methods Europeans used was the introduction of firearms and alcohol. These goods were highly valued, in many cases coveted by African tribes. The Igbo, Ashanti, Mende, and Fulan were among the many tribes that found themselves caught in the complex dynamics of the slave trade. European traders would offer these tribes guns and alcohol in exchange for enslaved individuals, typically prisoners of war or members of rival communities. The Ashanti of Ghana, for example, were known for their powerful kingdom and military prowess. Europeans capitalized on their desire to expand their territory and influence by supplying them with firearms. In return, the Ashanti would capture and sell members of neighboring tribes into slavery. This not only provided the Ashanti with the means to dominate their rivals, but also entrenched the slave trade further into the fabric of West African societies. Similarly, the Igbo people of Nigeria, who were predominantly organized in decentralized communities, found themselves vulnerable to the pressure exerted by both neighboring tribes and European traders. The lure of firearms and other goods led some Igbo leaders to participate in the capture and sale of their enemies, perpetuating a cycle of violence. The Mende and Fulan tribes of West Africa also played roles in this tragic process. The Mende, known for their agricultural skills, were often targeted by some militaristic tribes armed by Europeans. The Fulan, with their extensive trading networks, were sometimes coerced into facilitating the capture and transportation of enslaved individuals across vast distances. This splinter and dominate strategy, fueled by the enticement of material goods like alcohol and firearms, enabled Europeans to extract a continuous supply of enslaved Africans. It represents a stark example of power exercised without compassion or respect for human life. Yeah, like it kind of that history of slavery that Africa did have, but the type of slavery was different though. Like you alluded to. There was it was sort of chattel style, like there was ownership of people, but like the trade in slaves was for military service. It was for like domestic service. It was slavery, captured slaves during warfare, that sort of thing.
Yes.
Where the involvement of the Europeans was almost a opportunity for some of these heads of tribes to gain a foothold on their competitors. And the other thing I want to mention is that you have a lot of people, usually right-wing people, that say you your history is that you sold your people, and they go on like this, right? Adopting today's standard of ethnicity. Like you're black and your people. So, but the thing is though, and it's sort of today too, there was no adoption of a broad ranging black ethnicity at the time. It was all about where you were from. Like the idea of a black race was actually instituted by the colonizers. It wasn't instituted by black Africans.
Right.
You can't think of Africa as a whole. Africa is a collection of nations, a collection of tribal people, right?
Yeah.
And there's huge differences between each one of these tribes, culturally, linguistically.
Yeah.
They thought of themselves as completely separate. So when they went to war, and for them to capture slaves and sell them to the Europeans was not a huge deal. There weren't no ethical ideas around that, right?
Yeah, it was like, you were prisoners of war, basically.
Yeah.
Just, and traded for goods, for that matter. And
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And there was another, not only Queen Nzinga, but there was also a place called, I hope I'm saying this right, it's called Benin. It's spelled Benin. And apparently they were one of the biggest ports of slavery in Western Africa. They were sending people off to Brazil, to Haiti, and the United States. And even just what you were saying about people looking at themselves in their relationship with the slavery the stuff that happened with slavery. This place is one of the biggest places that people often come back to try to find out who they are. Because it was such a big thing. Like a lot of people were displaced, and and like you said, people didn't know who they really were. And what the other thing that happened is today that family, they were called sort of the godfather of the city. His name is Francisco Felix de Souza. He's considered the father of benign, and he became the biggest slave merchant. And today, his family still rules it. Like, it just goes on down the line, and none of them sort of want to face or look at the role that they had in slavery. In fact, a lot of African countries and nations don't know how to sort of look at that and their role, held themselves accountable for slavery. Like in the US, say for instance, you know there's all kinds of guilt about that and different conversations going on, and there's also been talk about reparations and different things like that.
Yeah.
But how do you do that to a people, you know what I mean, in Africa? So I
Yeah.
don't know, it's yeah.
Yeah, it's a complicated issue because yeah, the I believe the the city of Benin,
Benin, sorry.
yeah, it was the Yoruba people of Nigeria that were mostly, but the thing is though, these tribes were warring with each other. So,
Yeah,
it would be in some time periods, it would be the one group like the Yoruba that would be capturing their competitors and selling them to the slavers. But then in other time periods, that group would be capturing some of the Yoruba and then uh, you know selling their captured people off to the slavers. So
yeah, yeah.
like even though they were involved in the slave trade, they were also victims of the slave trade
Yeah,
to some
big time,
degree.
big time. Oh yes,
So
yes,
it's
yes.
kind of hard to rectify that, right? And
Hmm.
but acknowledging that these peoples were part of the slave trade and victims of the slave trade at the same time, I think is important.
Yeah, there was, I think, a president uh, of one of these countries. He went to Baltimore and he sort of got down on his knees and sort of like just begged for forgiveness of the country that he was from and what had happened. Even in America. You know what I mean? Like, because
Hmm.
there's so much guilt and different things involved. Like, he didn't feel bad that he was his ancestors were involved in slave trade. He didn't feel bad about what happened, but he wanted the history to be known, right? And
Yeah,
I think that's the biggest thing. I think we should all own it, no matter
yeah, definitely.
where we were, whether you know you were a slave merchant in African days and you were a queen that was giving your people, and it went on down the line. Own that fact that this is one of the biggest frauds in history, and just own how evil it was. And we can't control what the past happened. We can only focus on the future, but recognize the damage that has been done because of these
Hmm.
this travesty. It will never be, I don't think it will ever be eradicated, because so much damage is done, and just the general generational trauma gets passed on and on and on. But if we can hold steady and know that this happened, where can we go from here? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
That's what's, I don't know.
definitely. And just to circle around, like understanding the motivations behind it, I think
Yeah.
are key, because
Hmm.
that kind of, and it's kind of hard to separate some of the emotions regarding this subject matter, regarding the
Yeah,
transatlantic slave trade. But
definitely.
the fact that um you went from, like, looking at the British side of things, right? Like they went from a system, like you look at their systems of labor, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
The systems of labor, they went from the feudal system where they had serfs, like they had people that worked the land for
Yeah.
generations,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that was kind of, and there's no equivocating chattel style slavery, which is the transatlantic slave trade,
Yeah. Hmm.
and being a serf on the land, because these people, the serfs had rights and freedoms, they could
Yeah.
travel, they were attached to the land,
Hmm.
right? Like if the landowner sold the land, he sold it with the serfs,
Yeah.
but they weren't the monetary value. It was the land that was the value.
Yeah. Of
So
course.
the Europeans moved from that to a system where the actual trade of humans
Hmm.
evolved, right? We
Yeah.
have to say, okay, well, why did that happen? I know there was huge expansion, and there was need for a lot of labor,
Yeah.
but the evil behind it, the greed, the money,
Mhm.
this is what we have to acknowledge, right?
Yeah.
This is the behind this is the overwhelming force behind it.
Yeah.
Um, it's not just simple someone being evil,
No, it's
right?
true.
We
Yeah.
have to acknowledge the greed behind all
Yeah.
what transpired.
Yeah.
Definitely, man.
And also with the transatlantic slave trade, like it became racialized slavery. Like, you know
Yeah,
what I mean? In that
exactly.
sense. And the Europeans did as well. And they maximized this kind of like power and control to maximize their plantations because it was slavery became such a cheap way to deal with these burgeoning industries that were happening,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, and like you say, the bottom line was the greed and all the money that was lining people's pockets, right? And
Mm-hmm.
you know, they just didn't care about who did what and who brought it in, you know. But it just so happened that, you know, the
Yeah.
blacks became sort of, you know,
It
the
was
stars of the Atlantic slave trade. Yeah.
currency, man.
Yeah, currency. Yep.
Currency. Yeah, that all about the dollars.
Yeah, dollar bill, y'all. And it don't stop. Okay, enough.
Anyway, yeah, we got
Don't want hip hop and slavery.
hip hop and slavery.
Breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground.
You have been listening to Down Home. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
Breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground, yeah. On a high plateau, from the one down below to the future of the funk, getting lost in the flow. Contact with the spot magex. Now it's time to flex with the force from the soul, reaching all aspects, getting deep, no time to sleep. As you reach your next phase, laying it all on the line. New trails start to blaze. It's a fire inside, a brand new path, breaking down the sum to one. Feeling free, I just laugh with the joy.
The song Breaking New Ground from The Breakdown.
The vibe like magic prescribed, only to see the perfect blend, like a diamond in the rough, ready to drop a perfect gem. It's time to shine so fine to see what you find.